Welcome to another episode of Tending the Fire, a Journeyman podcast. Journeyman of North Carolina supports adolescent males on their paths to becoming men of integrity. We believe that initiating and supporting boys on their challenging journey into manhood is vital for a just and sustainable future. And now our hosts, Jordan Bowman and Brant Evans.
We have John Wood Jr. coming to us. He's the brand ambassador for Braver Angels, which is an organization that is dedicated to the depolarization of the American public and the sense of creating more of a sense of the American family is, I believe, how he put it. Jordan Bowman is also on. He's co-hosted with me before. He is one of the directors with Journeyman Triangle, which is an organization dedicated to group mentoring and rites of passages work with boys 12 to 17. This conversation was awesome, and I really enjoyed getting to see John let his nerd flag fly with our conversations around archetypes and stories, specifically like animes and things like Lord of the Rings that we grew up with, and how those archetypes and story roles come to life for us. I'll let it speak for itself, but I would wait until towards the end. I think John really gets ahead of steam with some stuff that is different than the material I've seen him produce before in a refreshing and awesome way. Yeah, hope you guys enjoy.
Yeah, so we are at Braver Angels contemplating some initiatives that really involve sort of direct engagement with the most polarized groups in American politics, which, specifically means sort of mainstream of the Trump supporting conservative spirit of America, and on the one hand, in social justice oriented communities of color on the other hand. And in the course of having these internal conversations about sort of the pretext for which we pursue convening these two groups together, possibly in strategic collaboration over material issues such as, let's say, voter suppression / voter integrity and other things, we've thought a lot about, questions that will come up over, are the concerns that different groups have in their own eyes, at least about certain issues, sort of asymmetrical. What does questions of representation look like when you start pulling folks from these different groups in order to get them to share space? How do we see to it that the Braver Angels kind of ethos is asserting itself in a context where these other groups are bringing very different kind of, sort of social norms to a political dialogue, particularly when it's not just about building empathy across divisions, but about potentially finding common ground on policy, let's say. So we're contemplating kind of moving more deliberately into that arena, at least more directly than we have up until now. And so that's just bringing with it all sorts of considerations and so forth. In the meantime, I've got a family. I'm a husband and father. I've got 3 kids of my own. You guys saw one before we turned the recording button on. They get bigger and bigger every day. We're looking at buying a house pretty soon and moving out of the neighborhood here. And so, all of this and as we move out of the lockdown era, hopefully, sooner and sooner. And so all of that kind of stuff is on my shoulders. But yeah, these are all good problems to have. So not complaining.
Where are you looking to move to?
Triana, my wife, she's been wanting to move out, honestly. She wants to join the California exodus. I've wanted to stay in Los Angeles. The compromise is that we'll stay in California, but we'll move out of LA, at least, over the short term here, to somewhere that, will allow us to get a bit more land for a bit less money. Because, you can easily spend $750,000 on a shack in the city of Los Angeles, depending on where you're aiming. And so, these kids need room to stretch a little bit. So I don't know. We haven't decided, but maybe Temecula, maybe Southern California wine country. I don't know if you guys are familiar, but they've got some nice places out there near you. And we're looking at places kind of, adjacent to Los Angeles County, or maybe between LA and San Diego, so. Yeah.
If you join the bandwagon coming from California to Raleigh, let me know.
Or Asheville, man. Just gonna throw that out there too.
Carolina's a nice state. I've been through just a little bit, but yeah, for sure. Let you guys know.
Cool. Feeling grateful to have you on, John. Grateful Actually, Jordan and I were talking about this. I don't have a big draw with this podcast or anything like that. And I've had a few folks on who I think of as really sharp thinkers. So fortunate to be able to plug in and have those conversations. We live in an era where that's possible. So yeah, in touch with some gratitude there. Yeah. And I'll leave it there. I know don't have forever, so I'll keep it short. I'll be long-winded about other stuff. Yeah. So John, I think just to throw it out there, we mentioned this before, but one of the things that we do with the group mentoring is rites of passage work. And this idea of really Joseph Campbell's idea of the initiation and the hero's journey and like crossing the threshold into healthy masculinity for our boys and community-minded adulthood. One of the things that we've done in the COVID era is do fully outdoor wilderness solo experiences for the boys where they're alone for 48 hours. And we put a lot of intention into that container. I was commenting with Jordan that it's interesting because, you spend the Braver Angels piece is bringing people together, right, to have the conversations. And there's something intensely social about that. And then the work that we've recently done is, as Jordan would say, it's, within. And so they're, in a sense, alone, even though there's the connection and lots of support, lots of ceremony that goes into it. Or like 2 weeks before that, I had done a meditation retreat where I'm just like completely by myself and just the different facets of what I consider ingredients of important development. It reminds me of a time in my life where I remember I did a group relations conference, which is like experiential group psychology experience, intensely social. And then, but that kind of difference was sticking with me as we were prepping for this one. Mm-hmm.
Well, do you want me to respond to this idea of a distinction being drawn between sort of gathering work focused in on kind of internal reflection versus socializing people together in a way to where the focus is on getting to know about somebody else's kind of, internal reality?
Sounds like you got something. So yeah, let's hear it.
Yeah, it's an interesting distinction to be drawn. And of course, I'm not deeply familiar with the process that you're describing, although I'm interested in it, particularly in understanding, sort of how it is that interacts with the natural landscape, with the wilderness landscape that I think you're sort of mentoring young people to be able to function in. One thing I would say is that I do think that in Braver Angels work, when you zoom out a little bit and look at the full spectrum of our offerings, we do have something called a Depolarizing workshop, right? So for folks listening who are not familiar too much with the methodology of Braver Angels, we have a whole lot of different workshops as well as other forums that is aimed at convening people that dialogue across differences. But we do have some work that is about getting folks to look internally at their own attitudes to assess sort of what is polarized within you, within your own psychology. When you think about folks on the other side of a particular, identity or cultural divide, what are the sort of, what's the sort of imagery or assessment that kind of instinctively surfaces? And, we've got in this particular workshop exercises aimed at getting people to be sort of aware of what that reflexive kind of illustration is of the other side, and to refine that, through a process of self-reflection and becoming educated about some of the deeper sorts of representations of just what a conservative actually is, or just what a liberal actually is. And, coupled with some internal exercises that kind of focus in on, how can I halt this thought kind of in motion a little bit? And so I think that ultimately being able to successfully empathize with somebody and develop a connection across some line of cultural difference, it has to be in part consequence of a shift internally, a shift within the person's, own way of thinking. Now, that's not to say you might not be thrown into a conversation across some difference wherein you see something in the other person that you relate to doesn't spark a difference in you. It's not to say that you have to achieve some level of enlightenment necessarily before you go into some of these cross-cutting conversations. But it is to say that what we seek to do is to sort of a larger kind of, in our spirit of our conception of, what it means to be a citizen in American democracy, if you will. And part of what we want to sort of instantiated to that conception is an idea that goodwill should be sort of the starting posture with which we regard everybody in the American family, let's say. And that in so doing, this frees us up psychologically to be able to more effectively communicate across differences and to signal to people the fact that disagreement does not make us enemies to each other, at least not in my mind as an individual, therefore giving you permission to reciprocate some charity of understanding in return. So I would say that, I think that there's not necessarily an ultimate separation to be made between the need to, on the one hand, focus inward and sort of, come to a deeper understanding of how one's internal universe operates and a more constructive kind of social dynamic. But I think it probably is also fair to say that we can look at these at a process level as occupying distinct but perhaps connectable sorts of lanes of investigation and imagination, you might say. So that was brought to my mind as I heard you sort of point to the possibility of a contrast between those focuses.
Yeah, right on.
I've been to one of the Depolarizing Within workshops. I thought it was really cool. And do that self-analyzation. I think it's definitely a commonality between Brave Angels and Journeymen is that there's some level of self-understanding that you need in order to bridge divides. One of the things that comes up for me is I heard you mention that like what Brave Angels does is kind of like marriage counseling, or like you use the technology of marriage counseling in a partisan divide context. And in working with youth, there's a lot of kind of ego construction, right? Like they're learning who they are, they're learning what their identity is. I'm curious, well, how would something like that apply if you've never even had a girlfriend yet, right? Like, how's the marriage counseling techniques going to land? And again, like I know we're kind of just exploring this. I don't expect you to be an expert on this piece, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts around how to appeal to the youth with some of this kind of concepts and processes that you guys are using.
And I think that when you look at our polarization, it is a tension, a combustible tension that exists between different groups, not just on the basis of intellectual differences of opinion on policy, but on the much more deeper and more sensitive levels of friction being perceived between us on the level of identity, right? And what we take to constitute identity, whether it is ethnic or religious markers or political markers, such as your party affiliation or your stated ideological orientation, whether we think of these things explicitly or merely implicitly as identity with respect to ourselves, it is generally the case that our politics have been subject to sort of a phenomenon, and an old familiar one in civilizations, wherein just showing up in a certain uniform or seeming to wear a certain uniform triggers a cascade of assumptions that may not allow for the intervention of reason or empathy in delicate social and political interactions. But with younger people, and I think this is more true the younger you go, they're still in the process of forming their identities, and therefore perhaps still in the process of solidifying their prejudices, right? Which is, which I guess is the good news, really. And this is why we all have an interest in being a constructive influence on the young, on the youth, the kiddos. God, I'm old. I don't feel like it until I start to think in terms of how to talk in a way that makes it seem like it might make young people interested. But this is why it matters, right? Because it is humanity in development, and the potential for them to be better than us is still there. That's why what you guys do is so important. But how to connect it to what we do? I think that, Brant, you are well equipped for what you do because you have an appreciation of the importance of story and myth as really being sort of the doorways towards a holistic kind of communication of a value system and a way of being in the world to folks who, and to younger people in particular, who are not necessarily going to have the resources of deep political study or experience with our larger kind of, societal histories and storylines and so forth. You're able to get at something much more elemental through story. I do remember relatively recently, on the cusp of the presidential election last year, giving a series of speeches to a private academy in Connecticut that was K through 12. I gave 3 speeches. One was to the elementary school cohort, the other was to the middle school cohort, and then the last was to high schoolers and some faculty. And so that did give me the opportunity to think very deliberately in terms of, like, what is the developmental kind of, sort of arc to the message of Brave Angels and my own articulation of it, and how does that need to render itself in speaking to these different audiences? And I think all 3 of those speeches went really, really well. In a way, I was most pleased with the first one, with the youngest kids, because it forced me to just think in strictly kind of elemental and archetypal terms. And as I am searching my memory a little bit, but I started off, actually, Brant, I think you would have been proud of me, man. I started off with something of a Spider-Man reference, and I found an excuse to work in the whole with great power comes great responsibility angle. And I think where I kind of began with that was to let these kids know that you're not thinking in these terms yet, but each of you is a citizen of the United States of America, which has for a long time been, you would say, the most powerful country in the world, and country which is meant to set the standard in terms of freedom and equality for the world. Not to say that we do so perfectly or don't, but within that country, you as citizens, as members of your community, and as kids are going to become adults with voices and minds that can shape the things around them, have great power and influence. You will become the heroes in your own story, but what gives us the power to ultimately move that story towards the good? And so then I shifted into a story that I know well, which is the Lord of the Rings story. I think I talked a fair amount about Frodo and the ring and what made Frodo able to ultimately, though he was not large, though he was not strong, though he didn't even really have a strong understanding of the history of the world that he was operating in. He wasn't Gandalf, he wasn't Aragorn, he didn't know the history of Gondor or Sauron or all of these other things. But Frodo was able to bear tremendous burden, a tremendous responsibility, because he, of his nature, had an ability to see the best in people, to not hold on to bitter grievances. And therefore, he was able to hold the ring, and the ring itself being this powerful sort of vehicle for exploiting the inner sorts of demons that we have within ourselves, tended to be very corrupting of much more powerful and more educated warriors and wizards alike. But Frodo had this powerful potential because he had not really been corrupted by those temptations and streams of bitterness, those streams of hatred and fear and grievance and what have you. I made the point to these kids that right now, you kids are all Frodo, and that means that you have the potential to kind of save us from ourselves. The rest of us have all drunk in sort of these partisan and polarizing narratives. And some of your parents are Republicans, some of your parents are Democrats, and your parents may be both. You may have one on each side. I said, the thing that I want that you may not yet be fully aware of, but that you will come to notice as you grow, or maybe you have noticed it, given the backdrop of the Trump election, so on and so forth, is the fact that right now, our entire country is listening to one story or another that basically is making the point that your mother or your father are the enemy, are in some sense a bad person or somebody who should not be trusted. This is the story that the country is telling right now about your parents in one way or the other. But you, being your parents' children, know that your parents love, that your parents have goodness within them, and that there's ever so much to be loved and respected and admired about your mom and dad. There's a difference between the story that the country is telling itself about your parents and what you know to be true. In coming to appreciate that, Yeah, I think I tried to communicate the idea that there's sort of a journey in front of all of us, but certainly in front of these young people, wherein they will have to come to understand what the legitimate reason is for the differences that cause us to distrust each other in American life are, while at the same time never letting go of what they know already, which is that at the end of the day, these pictures that we're painting of their parents is not the true image of who they are, even if these stories exist for a reason in our national consciousness. My memory of when I said to these kids was imperfect, but it did seem to be impactful to be able to communicate these things in terms of Marvel and Middle Earth and so forth. And these are modern applications of essentially sort of mythological sorts of narrative structures. I think you probably agree, Brant, or at least that there's a deep connection. I think that it becomes important for us to think, and I wouldn't pretend the Braver Angels has quite gotten there yet, but the more we think in terms of reaching young folks, and really this is powerful for adults as well, it's worth considering how it is we can more effectively apply story and archetype, myth, popular cultures to how we communicate the imperatives for this sort of transcendence. And Chloe Valdery is someone who does this very well with theory of enchantment, her approach to diversity, equity, inclusion work, etc. So those are some opening thoughts, and that is an example of how I've tried to communicate effectively kids of a certain age.
Yeah, I appreciate the optimism and hope in that piece too. It's kind of a hard act to follow, but one of the big pieces that I struggle to place right now we have some understanding about how the adolescent brain develops and how it works. And there's less of a capacity for them to tap into the prefrontal cortex. That part of the brain that you guys do that work of speaking to, if you're depolarizing, you're taking that minute, you're tapping into the thinking part, like learning how to take that pause. That's really hard for adolescents. It was for me, and the science says that too. And at the same time, they are being bombarded with political information and propaganda on both sides and through channels that are hard for me to even imagine. I'm not that old or that far away from being a teenager, but there's no comparison. I didn't have one of these in my pocket that blasting me with news sources and narratives constantly. So we talk about stories, and I guess what I'd offer is that it works both ways. I think that younger minds can really soak in those stories at a deep level without necessarily knowing that that's happening. And my concern is that, are we being good stewards? Are we being good storytellers to the younger generation? I know that we have some people who pay a lot of attention to that and are really pushing for that. I like to think we formed a really powerful story around the work that our guys did recently on that weekend. I'm definitely concerned on a more cultural level that we are not being good storytellers. We're telling stories that will take us apart, that will exploit the algorithms versus an adolescent mind. That kind of like orientation seems troubling, I'll say.
Right. Well, yeah, it definitely is. We just released a podcast with Tristan Harris, our second conversation on the Braver Angels podcast today. What Tristan talks about how the design of social media, the major social media platforms and other algorithmically driven platforms that distribute content and facilitate communication is meant to overwhelm human sense-making abilities as a means of keeping your attention focused on your social media feed. Your attention is monetized, of course. And we are overwhelmed by a system that, on the basis of our demographic information and just a little bit of input in terms of what we voluntarily start off clicking, because the platforms have essentially unlimited data showing how folks of a certain demographic with a certain sort of content preference will be inclined to consume more and more information and stimulus that is trotted out of what they can anticipate one's preferences to be. You are overloaded with recommendations and posts that speak what you want to see, but to the wants that arise potentially from parts of you that are undisciplined and easy to exploit, from your fears, your wants and desires, prejudices, and so on and so forth. We as adults are overwhelmed by all of this. And it's warping our ability to communicate with each other and to reason with each other and to make sense of the world. Young people and adolescents in particular on social media, there is this terrible intersection with, on the one hand, a young person being in a formative stage in their life where they're trying to come to grips with their identity and everybody is insecure and trying to understand who they are. And they're being presented with the face of reality, let's say on Instagram, even certainly the more visual social media sites, wherein everybody is sort of motivated to present the most idyllic possible representation of their reality, you know, in a way that, one, doesn't really reflect people's reality, and two, makes other people feel like they're missing out on all the happiness of life. And that leads directly to depression and even suicide, particularly among young girls, from what I understand, teenage girls.
Yeah, Jonathan Haidt, he hits on that, I think, pretty firmly around the effect with adolescent girls being. Real quick, I want to throw out this thought. We were talking about the archetypes, and this popped into my head as you were speaking. It seems like we designed AI and the algorithms to invoke the addict archetype in ourselves because it's easy to make money off of that, right? And if we're invoking the healthy king archetype in young men, for example, that's a little harder to profit off of, right? Because there's the independence and autonomy and a generosity that comes with that. It's a lot harder to predict. It's a lot harder to just make a quick dollar off of. So there's not like that conscious intention there, but what do we see? We see material that's designed to suck us into these dark fantasies to where we're just doom scrolling on Twitter, on Instagram, or whatever it is. We're predictable. You know, the addict is predictable.
I'm curious to ask, how old are each of you guys? And don't mind me asking.
I'm 26.
34.
Okay, so you and I are the same. Did either of you play RPGs, role-playing?
Oh, yeah. RuneScape.
Okay, give me a couple. What were they for you?
Diablo 2.
Yeah, oh yeah, Diablo, RuneScape, World of Warcraft a little bit. I didn't get sucked in.
Gotcha. Yeah, I played the original Warcraft. I don't think they call it
Warcraft, Reign of Chaos or Frozen Throne.
It was like whatever the first one was, where there wasn't any storyline really, but you got to set the pieces and you guys put them in battle arrangement. It was pretty cool. But I was big into a few. There was one called Wild Arms that I played through. A couple more obscure RPGs called Suikoden, Suikoden. But the one that had the biggest impact on me by far was the Final Fantasy. The more I think about it, I realize a fair amount of my imaginative programming came from that game. When we talk about cultivating healthier archetypes in people, and certainly in younger people, and how difficult it is, I bring up the RPG games because, at least with the games that I played, you had all sorts of stories and interaction of archetypes. But the main character, the hero character, gave you an opportunity to live out sort of the role of the hero archetype in a way that took an unhealthy amount of time. I'm sure I failed a couple of classes because I was playing that game. It's a bit of a mixed bag. But Cloud, the main character in Final Fantasy VII, with Cloud, you're not told what his virtues are, but you come to feel them very, very quickly. He's not ideological. He's humble, yet he is strikingly courageous. He's deeply loyal. He's relatable in the sense that he's trying to find himself. And in the context of this story, it's a very complicated storyline. But Cloud is, as I recall, I may be getting this wrong so many years later, but he is.
I have a feeling you're going to get it based on how this conversation started.
Well, maybe. I mean, as I recall, Cloud is basically sort of, he is a person who was more or less kind of genetically engineered using DNA that was borrowed from this soldier and maybe spliced with an alien race. And that alien race was sort of an ascended kind of angelic race. But what Cloud was sort of a mix, I think, of that and this super soldier who was himself deeply corrupt and was bent on eliminating the last of these ancients, as they called them. And Cloud, therefore, kind of didn't know what he was, and he had lost a lot of his memory to boot and so forth. So he had to just figure out who he was from the bottom up. I'm sure I actually got a little bit of that wrong, but I think enough of that gets the idea across. And, you know, hundreds of hours of playing that game, the story starts off with Cloud being a part of a pack of political rebels. who are basically they're eco-terrorists. And so there's a whole other issue because there's a glorification of eco-terrorism at the beginning of this game. But they're eco-terrorists in as much as they're trying to save the environment from a corrupt corporatist state that is extracting the life force of the planet and so forth. And into that political storyline comes this other storyline of the ancients and this super soldier and so on and so forth. It gets wild. But in the course of all that complexity, me at the age of 13 or 14 kind of lived out this storyline where ultimately you kind of had to see through all of those other layers to realize that, the reason Cloud could be the hero is because he never got so wrapped up, in the politics or the ideology or in these ancient sort of beefs and vendettas. He always had something of a pure sort of orientation towards, just being good, if you will, and figuring out what that meant for him, So his journey is deeply internalized, even as he's out there in the world fighting monsters and bad guys and so on and so forth. And I think that it is possible, as we consider how it is that what we know with respect to how we may developmentally progress towards being more empathetic and loving human beings, and how that can translate into social strategies that allow us to build stronger communities and even, more deeply rooted democratic processes. I think it's possible to wed those insights to some objective in the digital and social media and technological space that says, okay, how can we take those insights and feed them into some archetypal representation of, what the hero is, what the good king or queen is, and represent that, thematically or somehow or other narrative fashion in a way that allows social media and digital interaction to play out as something of a video game that cultivates, those aspects of character,
Well, can I interrupt you for 1 second? So I'm realizing, I guess, more and more that, the story, getting the stories right, telling the right stories and then also like fostering a curiosity about the stories. I would argue that that's a part of the picture of what's needed for youth specifically. There's another piece though, where that's not enough. And there needs to be an anchor to reality, because, we can have like people on the far right, way out there, who love the Lord of the Rings, and people on the far left who love the Lord of the Rings, right? Who are, and they are convinced that they're living the hero's journey of that story and that archetype. And that's right. So there's a piece of it. And I think this again connects to the Braver Angels thing. I don't have a way to cleverly correlate this specifically with like teenagers necessarily, but that seems very true to me, right? That we can't just, it's not just like, here are the stories. It's how do we interpret them and how do we anchor them, right? Because those are the most powerful moments for me is when you have the whatever feedback from your environment or a mentor or somebody you trust who's giving you the clue that maybe you're not like acting out that character's arc in the way that you think you are.
Can I jump in there? Because when you were talking about Lord of the Rings, I started to get this picture. You mentioned kind of the stories that were being told, the narratives that are coming down are putting the older people who have formed identities and formed prejudices into, right, Rohan, Gondor, orcs, elves, right? And they're solidified in those. And what came to mind for me was, well, what about like the Aragorns, and what about the Gandalfs, and even Theoden, who had that council and said, well, no, we're not going to support Gondor. And then he had this moment of like transcendence where it was like, wait a minute, there's a higher order. There's something else at stake here. There's this archetypal battle of good and evil that I'm going to transcend my tribal story to belong to. And same thing with Aragorn. He's like, he's I love Lord of the Rings. If you don't know Lord of the Rings, I'm sorry if you're listening to this podcast.
They know it. Just assume they know it, man.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Trigger warning up front. Disclaimer. But I want to watch the Lord of the Rings first.
Yeah. So here's the thought. So again, this is like a lot of my work is thinking about roles and organizations. And I I think I can honestly say there've been times in my life where I've been freaking Worm Tom. Like I've been in that like bitter and like whispering into like somebody's ear. But if you ask me, I think I'm Aragorn. I'm like fighting the good fight, right? Like I'm the good guy here, obviously. Like this isn't an original thought in that sense, but I wonder, like this isn't a message I hear a lot, but I really do think there's something around like, how do we anchor the story? How do we draw out perspective around like how we're acting out the archetypes? That's an important piece that, I don't think we get a lot of. It's like, here's Game of Thrones, here's the story, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, one person who does provide an immense amount of insight into that process, or these versions of that process, is Jordan Peterson. Well familiar with. And that really is what Jordan does. I mean, I think that you're right, Brant, that you don't see a lot of that out there, but that's kind of the main thing Jordan does in my mind. He establishes the archetypes, their significance in terms of what they suggest about the human spirit individually and collectively, and also how it evolves and progresses over time. I think he weds that to practical insights about, how you do manifest those qualities in your day-to-day life, clean your room, sit up straight, all that, and then he manages to, tie that to, how it is that you actually slay a freaking dragon and so forth, at least metaphorically. So you're right, man. That is the case. And I understand why you say that in the context of recognizing the fact that, we can all be aware of these stories and still be wildly at odds with each other because we are perhaps interpreting the implications of these stories differently. And, how many, the Bible, whatever anybody's particular religious beliefs are about it is, clearly, even if it is not just this, it is clearly a compendium of archetypes and narratives. How many wars have been fought within Christianity over differing interpretations of the same stories, right? And yet, I think that particularly in the modern age, we have this sense that if all folks who called themselves Christian were actually like Jesus, you wouldn't have any of that, which I also believe is true. But to be like Christ, to be like Jesus, it seems like you have to know more than just, he was born, he preached a message, he got crucified, died, came back to life. And, in the midst of all that said, hey, everybody better believe in me. There actually has to be sort of a deep understanding of, what is the internal spiritual reality of somebody who literally loves not just their neighbors, but loves their enemies. What does that look and feel like from the inside out? And how does that then manifest in conduct? It's one thing to watch the movie, Lord of the Rings or whatever, and to have fun with the fight scenes and all that. It's another thing, of course, to deeply contemplate what these things reflect about, the reality of human nature and the spiritual struggles with which we are all engaged. And so reflection on the stories has got to be more important even than the stories themselves in some sense, because there's a harvesting that has to take place. If your character is compelling and heroic to you, why? And part of what I see in what I would call like sort of cheap storytelling. I mean, for instance, my wife and I last night watched the new Mortal Kombat movie. And
dude, we're getting the good side of John Wood here. This is awesome.
Yeah, you guys are figuring out all sorts of unusual stuff to me. This is great. Yeah, we watched the new Mortal Kombat movie, and it was fun, right? Like, I enjoyed it and so forth. And there were actually some interesting things about it, but it's always clear when you're dealing with writing that at a certain point it has to get flashier and flashier and more combative because it's lost lost its ability to go deeper into the internal story. So basically, and actually Jordan Peterson has said this directly, and I remember him saying this about the book Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, which is a very, I don't know if you guys have read it, but
that one.
It has so much to do with informing libertarian and anarchist and perhaps thinking, and sort of an important philosophical text, but it's also a story, right? And I read it, and it certainly influenced my perspectives on things. But Peterson named something about that book that I felt while I was reading it, but never consciously articulated to myself until he had said it. And when you read that book, what Atlas Shrugged is in essence about is a statist society in the United States of America, some version of it she wrote, I think, back in the 50s, if I remember, that had been, a statist society utterly taken over by bureaucrats and so forth, who basically sort of viciously and vindictively scapegoated the most productive people in society, right? Seeking to sort of squeeze all the wealth and innovation out of those folks while also blaming them for everything that was wrong in society, and that basically allowed everybody else in society to look at themselves as victims who, were entitled to more and more of the resources of the productive people, not realizing that it's the innovators and the entrepreneurs who are actually keeping society afloat. And so at a certain point, those people, the people who are actually actually producing in society, they just kind of pull out. They go to some secret society in the mountains of Colorado. They're so technologically advanced that it's just this kind of, techno enlightened utopia of people who are all basically Elon Musk and shit, who got their stuff together, and their society is great, and the rest of the country kind of goes to hell, in their absence, or so we can assume. And so there's a moral to the story, all of that, but it's one monologue after the other, basically from people who have their shit together about how it is that the rest of the country does not, and therefore all of the conflict is external. And Jordan Peterson, in talking about Atlas Shrugged, made the point that, it's a very interesting book, but it fails to be great literature, because you can't have great literature without the conflict primarily being internal. There's like no internal conflict in Atlas Shrugged. All the characters are sure of themselves from start to finish.
Yeah.
And as such, it's missing, something deep. It actually, this takes me to something else. I feel free to interrupt me if I'm talking.
Well, I do want to say another a story that had it at the beginning and then has tailed off. And I believe you're a fan as well. You know what I'm going to say, John?
I think I do.
Yeah. Dragon Ball Z, man.
Oh, I thought you were going to say Game of Thrones, but Dragon Ball Z, I agree with you on that front too. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I agree with that. Dragon Ball Z. I love Dragon Ball Z right up until the end of Cell. Although I think that the best of Dragon Ball Z was up until Frieza, but I still dug it all the way up to the end of Cell. And by the way, that had a lot to do with the fact that it seemed to me that the native story of Dragon Ball Z was ultimately meant to be the coming of age of Gohan.
Mm-hmm.
Goku was the main character,
right?
But it was always really about, Goku reaching his potential so that Gohan could reach his.
Right. Well, and the redemption arcs with certain characters that, they never quite, is like, they never really gave like Vegeta the win, right? He kind of like back and forth. I mean, he has some moments of sacrifice, but in my mind, that's a story that lost the archetypal mandate.
Mm.
Yeah, they had a compelling archetype story, and then it crumbled. They lost it. It slipped through.
Well, that's why I said that. Yeah, I enjoyed it up until the end of Cell, probably because it built up to Gohan's, great moment. But I would say that the writing was best up until the end of the Frieza saga, and the most powerful moment in that arc was, and we should talk about Naruto because that's a real.
I don't know Naruto.
You don't know? Okay, so Brant, you got to do another episode after you've taken,
I'll do it.
a couple of years of your life to
I'm trying to beef up on the old myths, like Celtic myths and stuff, but I can take a break and do Naruto.
Honestly, Naruto is Dragon Ball Z is great, but Naruto is really, at any age, I think it is deep and profound across an epic length of time. But the most powerful scene that I thought was produced in the Frieza arc in Dragon Ball Z was the death of Vegeta.
Ooh, yeah.
The death, so so for folks who don't know, Dragon Ball Z, it's another complicated thing to try and describe, but it's basically, God, how do you describe it? It's basically about, so, it's set initially on planet Earth. The main character is a guy named Goku, who does not initially know that he is an alien.
John, there's no way we can do all this.
Oh, no, it's kind of like, there's a way to simplify it. It's kind of stupid, in as much as he comes from another planet. He eventually realizes he's an alien. He's got these powers of combat. And then he's got to go out into the universe and save the universe from some epic villain, so on and so forth. You're right. We can't do this.
It's great. But yeah.
But Vegeta is this other alien character whose whole approach, so these are all fighters and warriors. Vegeta's whole approach to achieving combat glory is just through brute strength and brute will. So archetypically speaking, Vegeta is, some version of, probably not fair to Nietzsche to call Ingermensch, but, just some characterization of that. For Vegeta, there is no right and wrong. There's only the will to power, really. And that does motivate him to being incredibly powerful. But Goku, on the other hand, is completely the opposite. Goku is really a pure soul. Goku loves fighting, but he doesn't like hurting anyone. Goku seeks to protect people, and his power comes from simply embracing the art of combat in the service of others.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And
he's a warrior.
Right, exactly.
Or a soldier.
Yes, but in that highest, most noble kind of selfless archetype sense, rather than in the lower brutish kind of sense of that. And so there's this prophecy of this. So they're both Saiyans. There's this prophecy of the Super Saiyan, right? And who, the prophecy suggests will be the one to come and defeat Frieza, or what have you, this intergalactic warlord. And Vegeta thinks he's going to be the Super Saiyan. He thinks he is the Super Saiyan. He, does everything he can do to train for it. He almost dies several different times. Finally gets his one-on-one with Frieza, who he has his own backstory with, and he loses in humiliating fashion. Then Goku shows up after having had to be rehabilitated in some chamber or whatnot after a previous fight. And as soon as Goku gets into the mix, he's reached a new level. He kicks Frieza in the face, whereas Vegeta just missed every blow. And Vegeta in that moment realizes, oh crap, I may not be the one who this prophecy was talking about after all. Fast forward a little bit, Vegeta's laying on the ground injured. Frieza ultimately decides to kill Vegeta because Vegeta is laying there saying Goku is the Kakarot, who's the same name, is the Super Saiyan. He's the one you need to worry about. Then, Vegeta gets blasted. He dies, but in his final moments, he basically confesses to Goku that, his hatred warped his personality. Frieza gave him that hatred, made him who he was. And then Goku goes on to actually be the Super Saiyan, and he wins the day. But it's this conflict of philosophies of power.
Well, there's also the two pieces there where Vegeta there's vulnerability that comes out through that defeat.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
There's a transformation there. And he recalibrates Goku because Goku is a little bit too happy-go-lucky, not taking anything seriously. And so he said, his last words are you have to take this seriously. This is different. You have to step into a different mindset. So there's the transformation. I mean, it's beautiful, beautiful stuff back there.
Piece of healthy burden, right? Not weigh you down, but a healthy responsibility. That John, I'll have to say that your explanation of Cloud was super helpful because I just got off the phone with one of our journeymen, and we're in the next group tomorrow night. We're exploring the hero's journey, and everyone's bringing their favorite hero, and his was Cloud. And I didn't know, but we're basically having people bring their heroes and their stories of those heroes and map those to the hero's journey, and then map that to their life as well. And so I'm looking forward to your series with Braver Angels doing that same thing across the country.
Hey, you guys are giving me ideas, man. You may be laughing, but this really
it's good
enough for another. It might have to bring you guys in to help us out.
Sure. Yeah. I think there's a huge potential for something like that, the teenage level, because we're already bombarding them with political messaging. So yeah, no. I mean, to me, dude, the best ideas come out when I'm laughing. So, yeah. But okay, I want to know this is interesting for our little process in this podcast. We brought out this idea of talking about, young men adolescents young men and young women. And, where do we go with it? We like went to our stories and like, it had like to me, it had like a childlike feel to it, which is pretty cool. I don't know. I think there's something about doing that work and contemplating that like brings out and like gets at least me back in touch with some of those pieces that I definitely don't want to lose touch with. Jordan, I mentioned on the weekend when we were hosting the solos, I was like just running up the hills, which reminded me of when I was a little boy. She used to like run like crazy. And yeah, there's something about like touching on it and discussing it that like brings it back up. That's my theory, at least.
Yeah. So you mean just referring back to one's own childhood stories as a way of, connecting and sort of illustrating your own journey. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's like listening to you get excited about the stories. There's like a youthful, like
that's true,
like adolescent energy there. It's awesome.
Well, and for me, mine was Lord of the Rings, right? Like growing up, like,
yeah.
and I was so into it. So when you were bringing that up, I was like running with this metaphor and like understanding like these elements of on a societal and cultural level, right? If we are in adolescence as a society in some ways, right? Like in which ways are we coddling Americans and saying, oh no, like go with your mother, ride that horse, right? In the Rohan scene where the two kids go up the hill and they hide in the Helm's Deep, right?
Yeah.
Like how are we treating people like that versus inviting them to the council where they're making the decision to like invite Gondor to help them fight or whatever, you know what I mean? Like those kind of things, they make it click for me. And I think it's going to be true with youth. I need to catch up on my Dragon Ball Z and Naruto to deliver this content later this summer.
So I know, John, I know you got to go. I want to respect your hard stop. Yeah. I really enjoyed this conversation. I love the work you do. Yeah. You're a rock star out there, man. So keep it up. And yeah, let's talk, man. I'll shoot you a DM about, I wonder what ways we could engage teens. I think that's a big part of the conversation and maybe a way that Braver Angels could even like expand its impact. So
yeah, 100%. Yeah, hey, this has been a lot of fun, guys, and you did give me an opportunity to range out a bit.
Yeah,
I don't usually get to do, but it really is all important stuff because we tend to compartmentalize these social questions, but really all of it is about the whole of our culture.
Yep.
Really. And there's so many resources there to be drawn upon that we don't initially think about when we think in terms of how to impact these problems, right? So
yeah,
conversations like these matter. So I'm glad we got to have them.
Cool. Well, I'm checking out Grateful, John. Really awesome to have this conversation with you.
What
about you?
100%. Checking out Grateful.
Yeah. I'm checking out with a lot of Dragon Ball Z that I need to watch.
Next one. Naruto is on Brad.
Right there. Yeah, I got that one.
Actually, can I give you a line from Naruto just to give you a sense of it?
Please.
So there's no way I'm going to be able to recap this storyline, but the Hokage is sort of the chief of the ninja village, right? And Naruto aspires to be the Hokage. And he's actually got a lot of anger, but he's got a lot of pure love in him as well, And towards the apex of the story, he encounters an enemy who is also kind of trying to be the Hokage. But he's trying to be the Hokage not by sort of leading everybody through their problems, but subjecting everybody to a mass illusion to make them think that their problems have gone away. And so Naruto is fighting him to keep him from putting everybody under this. I think he called it a genjutsu, if I remember, this mass kind of genjutsu. And he asked Naruto, he said, if you could just snap a finger and make everybody think their problems had gone away, haven't you done it, or something like that? And Naruto said, no. He said, the path of the Hokage, he said, what did he say? I'm going to get it slightly wrong, but he said, the Hokage, he said, does not seek the shortcut or the way to the easy path, but to navigate the rugged one.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of drives home
what
we're really here to do.
Awesome, man.
There it is.
Boom. Last word, John.
All right, man.
Take care. Be safe, man. Be well.
All right, you too.
Thanks.
That's it for this episode of Tending the Fire, a Journeyman podcast. If you'd like to find out how we can support your young man on his path to integrity and authenticity, reach out to us on the web at journeymanasheville.org or journeymantriangle.org. This has been a Realignment Media production.